to physically install the collar. And part of the reason I asked Brenda to be involved is because it sounded like, based on the fact that she stitches this all the way to the cut edge, that she and I have slightly different approaches. So I want to talk about my approach. I want her to talk about her approach, and then you guys can decide which approach works best for you. No matter what approach you take, the biggest difficulty that you've got with this assembly process is making certain, when all is said and done, that these edges line up like that. A lot of times they want to sit out like that. And that has to do primarily with the fact that you have 4 layers of fabric in here, which is part of the reason I like to leave this open, because it has to do with the way that I miter it later when I try and turn the whole thing right side out. Because as you can envision, what's going to happen is ultimately all that junk has to go up inside with all of this junk as well. So just by virtue of mass, by the fact that you've got all of these layers here, it automatically wants to do what we refer to as stair-stepping, where it goes and so part of what you're trying to do is, in the way that you assemble this, counteract that from happening. Now, the truth is, it's just a standard seam. And in fact, it's almost a repetition of your placket, where you're going to start with right sides together, stitch, flip everything over, shove it all inside, and then either do a slip stitch, an edge stitch, a stitch in the ditch to close it all up. The complexity comes from a couple of different things that you need to be prepared for. The first one, of course, is all the junk in the corners. The second thing is the curve. And the third thing is all of the seam allowance that's sticking up into the curve. If you think about your any princess seam, when you've got a curve in a pattern piece, it always feels like the two don't want to fit together because of the seam allowance you've added on. This one feels like it's too big because the seam allowance technically is making it larger along its cut edge. This one, the concave curve, always feels like it's too small because all of this seam allowance in here is constricting everything. So this is part of the reason that shoulder notch and your center back notch are so important, because they really are going to tell you if it fits together in paper, then it has to fit together in fabric. So the first thing I suggest you do is take your neckline seam allowance and trim it down to about 3/8 of an inch, a skinny half.
This is so hard.
Second thing you've gotta make sure that you've got is your stay stitch line through all layers. So you don't have your stay stitch line anymore in your underlap extension. So you've got 2 choices to make sure that it's there. The first one is to lay the pattern on top of this. You can lay the pattern back here and you can trace right there, the paper pattern. I think it's actually problematic to do it that way because your pattern actually stops right there in a way. And so that's part of the reason that it's missing. I think it's easier to actually take your placket and do this. And then you can see the stay stitch line right there, and so it can be transferred through to this layer. No matter what you do, you need to make sure that you have a very visible stay stitch line for the entire circumference of the neckline, including the underlap portion of the placket. I cannot wait to brush my teeth.
I brought mine too. We can do it together.
On the overlap side of the placket, you can decide, even though you've pressed it as an overlap, all of this is still flapping free potentially. And so it might be worth taking a minute and putting 2 perpendicular pins right here, holding this in place, and then stay stitching that section again to just glue everything together so that this can't move independently of this.
And it also allows you to see where to sew on the
Oh, that's true. On
interior.
the well, except you'll see that later after, because you'll be able to see it from your first line of sewing.
When you're pinning the collar.
Yeah, because you're pinning right sides together, so you can see the line right there. Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, that Brenda's right. That is helpful because that then shows you your line of sewing right here instead of having to peel this back to see the line of sewing from the wrong side. You've only got a 1/2 inch of seam allowance on the neckline edge of your collar, so you don't need to do any trimming there. You will do some trimming eventually, but I don't think you need to do any right now. Your next step is to lay the whole thing right sides together and start perpendicular pinning at all the appropriate spots. So at center front, at shoulder, at center back. And again, this is probably going to be, you have to do some angle pinning right here with these perpendicular pins, because otherwise the thickness, especially with the interfacing in the facing side of this, it'll start to throw it off. However, pretend I didn't say that. Let's say that again. So you want a perpendicular pin at all the appropriate spots. So your center front, your shoulder seam, your center back. You might want to consider doing angle pinning as well, just to be able to compensate for all the thickness you're getting. Don't forget, because you're doing right sides together, which of the two are you actually pinning to the garment in this step? The facing layer or the collar layer?
The facing layer.
Not true.
What?
Why not true? Which is why I hit the rewind button.
But
Where does the facing layer go?
Doesn't it lay up against the neck?
It does. So watch. Right sides together,
Oh, you're totally right.
you actually start with this layer first.
Wait, could you do that one more time so I could video that?
So since you're starting with right sides together,
Right there.
you've got the collar, and not the collar facing, lined up with the garment's neckline, and then it'll flip in this direction.
Thank you.
It is helpful. I didn't have you guys do it because I don't think you need to on this white fabric. Sometimes people stay stitch this line as well, or thread mark it, so that it is visible on the exterior. Much like when you went to finish your placket, you eventually are going to do that with the seam allowance and press it inward. Again, because this fabric is white and you're working in number 2 pencil, I don't know that it's crucial for this, but you could have done it if you wanted to. And certainly if it was a darker fabric, it might have been helpful. Now, let's talk real specifically about corners and edges. And I want everybody to come over and get over top of my shoulder.
Big pins.
Yeah, I was going to say, would you mind grabbing some?
Ow, ow, ow.
And you may want to video from here. Let's wait till Brenda's got some straight pins for us. As I said, the most difficult part is the corner right here, making sure that everything lines up so that you don't get any stair stepping. So here's the way that I do it. I start like so, and then I peel my seam allowance backward. I have the wrong side.
Ah.
And so I peel my seam allowance backward. So I've actually got it flat like that. Be careful. You definitely need a really strong, specific back stitch right here. This is already starting to, it may be starting to pop a couple stitches there. So make sure that it's good and secure. And I stab through exactly at that corner. So where the vertical edge meets the neckline edge on the pattern line. And I stab right through on the absolute outermost edge. So you can see how far out I am there. I've got one thread. This is a little bit like that very first pin you put in place when you're doing the continuous lap placket. It's frustrating because you actually kind of don't have anything to pin to. Again, I want to be really clear. I do not have my seam allowance flat like it is on that side. I've peeled it open like that so that it's out flat. Now I can angle pin and pin my collar to my neckline. And of course we're pretending that all these other perpendicular pins are in place. Much like we discussed with your placket as well, I'm actually going to use a third pin now, because this one is really useless in terms of actually holding anything together. And now we've made sure that that corner is exactly at that edge. And now I can do this and actually turn it into a perpendicular pin. So now that's secure. I'll come all the way around and do the same thing on this corner as well. So then you would have the corners and all of your perpendicular pins in place. And then you can go ahead and parallel pin the rest of the neckline. Again, we would have trimmed this seam allowance down to 3/8 of an inch. So it's gonna make it easier to work with. The whole thing will spread open a little more easily than it would if I were to continue forward with it right now. But let's do this for a sec, because this is a great illustration of what we were just discussing. There's my perpendicular pin matching center front of collar to center front of shirt. And look, this is exactly what we were just discussing. They imply that they don't want to fit together, right? But you know, if you've trued your paper collar to your paper neckline, that they actually do fit together. Trimming this seam allowance down to 3/8 will help. I also suggest doing what we did on the very first step of the placket as well. Remember how the placket started like this, and then when we started to pin it together, we pulled it open like that and turned it into a straight line? Do the same thing with this. Start to pull it open to get it to be more of a straight line.
You mentioned Friday that there wouldn't be any ease.
It's
in
true.
the collar.
There should not be. Not a bit. And again, if your paper pattern of your collar trues to the paper pattern of the neckline of the shirt, that will tell you whether you've got ease or not. And if you do have ease, then we need to get rid of it before you go any further. You can then parallel pin along the entire circumference of the thing. Keep in mind, how close together do your pins want to be, and what size bites do they want to take? Small. You know, when you've got a long straight line, you can get away with big bites and bigger negative spaces in between them. This kind of curve is not going to like that at all. What's going to happen if you do big bites and big spaces in between the two?
You're gonna have a lot of lines despite it being curved.
You're going to have a lot of inaccuracy, because you're right, it's going to sort of stair step like this instead of being a smooth curve. It does mean that it's a pain in the ass to stitch, but it sort of becomes a question of which is more of a pain in the ass. Pinning it and then stitching it slowly, or
on once.
pulling it out 3 separate times.
Yeah.
Okay, let's pretend, for the sake of argument, that everything is stitched now. With this in place, this seam allowance is then able to fold backward if we want it to. We actually don't want it to at the moment, but I want to be able to illustrate that. One of the things we talked about with your placket and with the assembly of the collar was using the flywheel on the machine to turn the needle to hit exactly the right point. I would always suggest beginning and ending the stitching of the collar in that same way, so that you can know that you've hit that exact corner where everything is supposed to converge. And even doing the back stitch by doing an industrial back stitch again to be able to reinforce everything. Using reverse is not going to be your friend on these corners. Why? Partially because one of the things you're having to deal with is how many layers of fabric have you got right there?
A lot.
You've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I believe. The weight of the presser foot and then using the reverse causes it to want to roll around like this. That's going to distort your accuracy right there at that corner. And the biggest problem is if you're off at the very beginning, then you're off the entire way around. It's so annoying. So turning the wheel by hand to get that kind of accuracy is a really good thing.
I have a question about stitch length. Is it 3 for stitching?
You know, you might want to turn it down just a wee bit on this. I wouldn't go too much smaller. Why wouldn't I go too much smaller? Any idea?
Because there are so many layers.
Gonna get tight?
Say that again?
Gonna get tight?
What do you mean it's going to get tight?
Well, the stitches are gonna be really small, and it's like the neck area where it's already kind of already constricted.
That shouldn't be too much of an issue. I mean, you are correct that the smaller your stitch length gets, kind of the more constriction on the fabric you get. But going from a 3 to a 2 wouldn't make an enormous amount of difference on this. Why
Just
else?
a tiny, tiny quarter less or something?
Yeah.
Okay.
But why wouldn't I go tiny? Because actually, if you were to take a sewing class at like Elfride's Fine Fabrics, they will tell you to do that, to turn your stitch length way down. In fact, as a side note, like the way they will teach you to stitch a dart is to start at the base of the dart on a regular stitch length, and then as you get closer to the apex, turning the stitch length all the way down, so that by the time you get to the apex, you're just doing this. And then you don't have to do any backstitch, and it supposedly helps release the thing more invisibly. But why do I, for you guys in particular and for what we do, why would I never ever recommend that?
Take forever.
It would, well, in my mind,
Taking forever is an interesting perspective. Take that ball and run with it.
in my mind, you're not only separating like 1 or 2 threads at a time, which seems pretty superfluous. If we have to take that out,
That's
And it's
the part
0,
right there. If you have to
gonna
take it
blow.
out, it's going to take a buttload of time, and what's it going to do to your fabric?
oh, it's gonna rip it up.
It's going to rip it up. In the long run, you know from doing your placket, because we're going through the exact same process, how many lines of sewing are we going to end up with along the neckline of the garment? 2. 1 for the initial line of sewing, and then 1 when we close off the facing on the other side. That's going to give us any durability that we need. And so I would leave it bigger for when you have to take it out, because almost inevitably you're going to have to take some of it out.
Yeah. I was just having problems with 3 when I was doing the placket, getting to the point. I was having a really hard time. It kept going past, the stitch length was long enough to like go past the line.
That's when you've got to turn the wheel, lift the foot, and sort of adjust so you're
Okay.
stabbing down right
Okay.
there.
Yeah, you can adjust it just at that point, you know, you can kind of wiggle
Okay,
a little bit without
okay.
having too much.
Okay.
Because you're exactly
Bump.
right. You can end up like in the middle of a stitch,
Yeah.
and you've got to hit right here, and it wants to hit right
Yeah.
here. So you have to jimmy it a little bit.
Okay.
Or you could do the math and
Oh my lord!
Measure.
cut how many stitches.
Be that forever.
Okay. I'll just wiggle it a little bit up.
So let's pretend that everything is now stitched in place. So it's gonna flip up and over like that, correct? It's gonna look something like that. How do you finish off the back side? The first thing you've gotta do is trim this seam allowance, which is at about 3/8. I would take it down to about 1/8.
Jesus.
What do you think? That scares you?
Oh, yeah.
What would you take it down to?
A quarter.
You take it to a quarter? Would you do any clipping
I
into
would
it?
try not to, but and sometimes instead of, in those spots, go lower, you know, because Yvonne always was against clipping, and so instead of just clipping vertically, if there's parts where your curve is more extreme than others, taking it down to the 8 in those places.
So what Brenda and I are talking about is you could leave this at a 1/2 inch. The truth is you could leave all of this here, and you could clip in this direction, much like you would if you had it on the dress form and you were draping. And that would allow you to still get the whole thing to spread open the way that it needs to. You wouldn't get this constriction that you're getting here. Part of what she's talking about is, take a look right here, for example. You have a very flat curve there, right? So you need less frequent clipping there. Or, on the other side of the coin, you can leave your seam allowance slightly longer there. Here, for example, where the curve almost turns a 90-degree angle, you either need more clips in this way, they need to be closer together, or you could take your seam allowance even shorter that way. No matter which way you go, ultimately what you want to do is try and eliminate a lot of the excess that's going to go inside there.
So, sorry, for a seam allowance, is that are you talking about the neck hole, or are you talking about the collar?
Right now we're talking about the neck hole. Collar, once we get to this state, this is all stitched together and you've got a 1/2 inch of seam allowance here. I would then trim this seam allowance of the first seam that you've stitched down to a 1/4 inch as well. Okay? Now, camera, zoom in. Here's the part I want to show you, and I'm curious to see what Brenda thinks. Take a look. You can actually see that either I'm off or I have screwed up Catherine's backstitch a little bit, because the point where the facing and the collar converge is not the same as where it's pinned together, which is not the good news. That corner should be right there, and that's exactly where my stair stepping comes in place. So this is a spot where I would want to correct it, because it should actually look like that after it's stitched. Do you guys see the difference?
No.
That's the way it should look. Here, I want to do it against
Wait,
this brown
oh, you're
background.
moving so
Hold on.
much.
That's the way it should look. Come get directly above me if you need to, because it's the only way you're really going to be able to see it. So, see this point here where the facing and the collar converge at the back stitch? That back stitch needs to intersect right there at the edge of the collar. So it looks like that. If it looks like this, which is what it started to do on mine, then you've got a problem.
That's going to be tricky.
This is why I say almost invariably you're going to be taking this back out, because with all of that seam allowance there, this wants to roll. Do you ever hand tack this first? No?
I mean, if it was really thick, super thick, maybe.
Okay, so let's pretend that the whole thing is stitched absolutely correctly and we're ready to move on. So that pin is representing my line of sewing. Looks like this from the right side. The next thing that I'm going to do before I do anything else, our ultimate goal is to do, get out of the way, this, blah, and then this, just like we did on the placket. So it's going to look like that, right? The biggest problem is it's really difficult to do that particular step right there at the corner. So I'm going to do this. It's kind of a gift wrapping thing. The first thing I do is I do this, and I shove all of that up inside. And you can see that I'm using my fingers flat on top of the table. The whole thing is flat on the table. It's not up in my hands. This is the way I would always suggest to do this. You can see that seam allowance is still pressed backwards in this direction, which is good, because then I can do that, fold exactly on that corner, and pivot. And then what you can kind of see is I'm pulling it pretty aggressively in that direction. You can see I still have a bit of a stair step here, don't I? That's not the great news, but that mostly has to do with the fact that I have a pin in there instead of the fact that it's stitched. I pull it pretty aggressively back on that side, and then I perpendicular pin. I will do that on both of the corners first. Then I'll get in here, I'll trim this seam allowance down to 3/8. Notice, this was trimmed to a 1/4, this was trimmed to a 1/4, this is 3/8 of an inch. You don't want this to be the same height or even shorter. You want it to be a wee bit longer. Because then you can press this back, and just like you did on your placket, lay it like so, perpendicular pin, and then you can decide, are you going to slip stitch it closed by hand, are you going to edge stitch it, or are you going to stitch in the ditch? All three are viable options. Now, there's one last thing that I want to discuss. And I realize that a lot of this is kind of abstract at the moment because you haven't done this. And so that's why I'm trying to get finished so you can start doing it and then you can see what these steps are talking about. I want you to go back here for a minute. We were at this step where we were ready to shove all of this stuff up in here. Now, one of the things I want you to keep in mind, when I say shove all this stuff, you only have a 1/4 inch of seam allowance, so you don't have a ton of excess there. The problem that creates, and tell me if this makes sense, because this piece is chopped right there, like that, this corner starts to flip around like a hangnail on your big toe in pantyhose. It's really super annoying. And your first inclination, because you've now started to be accustomed to mitering stuff off, like the cutting that you had to do here, it feels like that's getting in the way, and so you want to chop it off on a 45-degree angle. Do not do that. That will cause you big problems. Avoid that impetus at all costs. I cannot stress this enough. And you're always like, oh, I can just get rid of a little bit. Don't. You can't. I will tell you, do you agree with this? I will tell you from years of experience, it always seems like the right choice at the time. And you can even like work it with your fingers and get it pinned in place and like, oh, it'll be fine. It's never, ever fine. Guaranteed. All right. Does this all make sense?
Yeah.
In abstract, at least. So, guess what you're going to have done for class on Wednesday?
Collar's gonna be attached.
A shirt.
Collar's going to be attached to shirt, and then shirt is going to be done for the moment.
For Wednesday.
For Wednesday,
What are we doing again?
you're getting your collar attached to your shirt. It will still mean that you have the last 2 steps to do on this will be finishing off the hem here, finishing off the hem down here. But we're going to cover that when we get into skirts, which is what we're starting on Wednesday. Because guess what I bought yesterday?
Skirt fabric?
Fabric for skirts. Because I love being in Colorado Fabrics on Sunday instead of being on a stripper pole in the middle of the park.
Hey, Ted.
Hey, what?
So it's week 10 of 15. Can we check in about final projects when we need to find a model?
Yes, I will. No, I'm finding a model. You don't need to worry about that.
Beautiful.
I'm not even positive you're going to have a model.
What?
What?
You may just be working off of a dress form.
But I wanted Brenda to model.
I have to run around and set up chairs and stuff like that.
Here, see, you can see the person on the stripper pole there.
It would be fun.
We're going to have to upload it and expand it.
Do I need to keep videoing?
No, we're done.